Good morning, everyone. So last week we talked about the birth of Jesus, the Christmas story as we all know it. And this week we are following up with that story. We'll be reading from Luke chapter 2, verses 21 through 35. On the 8th day, when it was time to circumcise him, he was named Jesus, the name the angel had given him before he had been conceived. When the time of their purification according to the law of Moses had been completed, Joseph and Mary took him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every firstborn male is to be consecrated to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice in keeping with what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of doves or 2 young pigeons. Now there was a man in Jerusalem called Simeon, who was righteous and devout. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit was upon him. It had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not die before he had seen the Lord's Christ. Moved by the Spirit, he went into the temple courts. When the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him what the custom of the law required, Simeon took him in his arms and praised God, saying, "Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you now dismiss your servant in peace. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all people, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and for glory to your people Israel." The child's father and mother marveled at what was said about him. Then Simeon blessed them and said to Mary, his mother, "This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your own soul too." All right, so in this we see a couple of big things stand out to me. We see that what's happening is Mary and Joseph have brought the baby Jesus to the temple to perform a few of the rituals that were a part of every Jewish baby's beginnings. Well, I suppose not every Jewish baby's beginnings, but definitely the males and certainly the firstborn males. So we have Jesus being circumcised. We also have Mary offering the purification rites. And then we have Jesus being dedicated. We're not going to go into deep detail on all of those things, but we are going to look a little bit, at least into circumcision. So circumcision was a part of the covenant originally put in place by God with Abraham, Father Abraham. And all of his descendants after him, including the entire nation of Israel, engaged in that covenant. It was something that made them different from all the surrounding nations around them. And it was something, it was a step of faith towards the Lord, saying, hey, we know that we need a relationship with you, and this is a sign of our relationship with you. And it was something that the Lord had set up. And part of it, some scholars say that part of the reasoning was sort of a mortification of their flesh. It was an obvious sign, I guess an intentional scarring of their physical flesh that reminded them of the, I suppose, scarring of their spiritual state from sin, and it reminded them of the suppression that they sought to desire of that physical flesh, so that they could then, or not that physical flesh, but just a suppression of the sinful nature, so that they could then engage in a proper relationship with the Lord. So as we talked about in Romans, Paul talks about how through Adam, through the sin of one man, Adam, death came into the world, and so all die, for all have sinned. And so that is the concept of original sin. It's an inherent thing. It's almost genetic. We are born into sin. And so, like I said, this circumcision is kind of a reminder of that. It's a mortification of the flesh, reminding us that we are not, even from the beginning, born exactly the way that God intended us to be, which I know is a strange concept in our world today, because our world constantly is talking about, oh, however you're born, that's how God created you to be. But the fact is no, we're all subject to the fall, and we're all sinful from birth. And so while God does have intentions for us, and while he obviously can redeem our fallen states and does, and rejoices to do so, we are not born as he intended for us to be born. He intended for us to be born with no death in our future, with no sin in our future. But because of the sins of Adam, those are the realities that we live under. So anyhow, Jesus is taking part in this, and you may be thinking, well, now wait a minute, but he needs no mortification of the flesh. He does not need to be circumcised because there's no sin within him. He was not born with natural sin, with original sin. As we also talked about, that's a part of him being God's son, being conceived of the Holy Spirit in a virgin's womb. Because he doesn't come from man's seed, then he doesn't inherit man's sin. What? That's awesome. And so that's why Jesus has this sinless life that he can live out. So it begs the question, why then is he engaging in circumcision? That's kind of strange for him to engage in that particular ritual. Well, okay, first of all, obviously the obvious practical answer is that, I mean, he was a baby, right? And so it wasn't his decision, it was his parents. And you could say, well, Joseph and Mary were being obedient Jewish parents. But also, this was definitely within God's will, because by Jesus being circumcised as a young child, he has now placed himself under the law. As Paul says in Galatians 4:4-5, he talks about how Jesus was made of a woman, made under the law, basically saying that he's setting things up for him to be the perfect priest. He didn't engage in these rituals for his own benefit, but so that he could become the perfect priest for humanity, a priest mediating between God and man. And so he obviously can do that perfectly because he is in very nature God, as is told to us in Philippians. But also, he's born of a woman. He's a human. He had actual biological flesh that was assembled in a woman's womb by the nutrients that his mother Mary ate in the 9 months of pregnancy. But also beyond that, he's not just any human. He is a human that is part of God's chosen race of people, the descendants of Abraham. And so he's identifying that, he's being identified as part of that people through his circumcision. And so as he falls under that covenant, what's interesting is that he now is obligated to the entire law. And this is what makes his sinlessness even more legit. Because as we know, the Bible makes it abundantly clear that if you follow any of the law, then you have to follow all of it in order to live under God's favor and be a part of his blessing, which we also know that there is not any other human being that has ever existed who has obligated themselves to the law and perfectly obeyed every bit of it. And yet Jesus says, okay, I will obligate myself to the law, to all of it, the entire law, and I will perform it perfectly, sinlessly. And that's what he did. And that's what, like I said, made him the perfect high priest. He didn't need to sacrifice any sins or any sin offerings for his own sins. He could cover then the sins of his flock, of his people. But anyhow, so that's a part of why he engaged in this ritual of circumcision, or again, I know he was a baby, but that's a part of why it was in God's will that he should be circumcised. And then we also, like I said, we see the purification of Mary and potentially Joseph. We see the dedication of Jesus as the firstborn, being dedicated into being redeemed from the priesthood and whatnot. But that's all. We're not going to. I don't have time to go into all that. But the point is that these are all these rituals that are kind of. It's a similar idea. Jesus is saying, "All right, I'm here to be a part of the old law and to fulfill the old law through what I'm trying to accomplish here." And then next, we go into this man, Simeon. While they're in the temple, they meet this old guy, Simeon. And he is, he's a very interesting character. So he's described as someone who is righteous and devout, waiting on the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit is upon him. He is really almost like an example of the ideal Old Testament Jewish man right there. That's any time that people are described as following wholeheartedly after the Lord, that they're talked about as being righteous and devout. The entire aim of the prophecies in the Old Testament is waiting on the consolation of Israel, the coming anointed king who is going to rescue them from their enemies and free them from their oppression. These are, kind of the pinnacle themes and hopes for any righteous person in the Old Testament. They're righteous, devout, they seek justice. Some translations say that he's just and devout. And it says that the Holy Spirit was upon him. Again, every time the most righteous people in the Old Testament, it talks about how the Holy Spirit comes upon them to do something. All of the prophets, they had the Holy Spirit upon them as they prophesied. Even people who were not prophets by trade, people like David, King David, it would have the Holy Spirit come upon him so that he could prophesy, so that he could sing these songs of worship that we still sing to this day as psalms. So Simeon is kind of like, he's almost like the personification here of the Old Testament. It's almost as if God scraped together the Old Testament and was like funneling it into this one guy and was like, here's this little man that kind of describes the thoughts and feelings and hopes and fears of the people of the Old Testament. And what's interesting then is his response. He is waiting on the consolation of Israel, and when he sees the baby Jesus in the temple, it says that the wording is such that he was there and he was already waiting when Jesus walked in. So it's as if he was guided by the Spirit into this area, and he may not have even known what he was looking for. He may not have even known that he was looking for an infant, and suddenly this peasant woman comes in holding a baby, and he's like, and you can almost imagine that the Spirit is speaking inside him saying, "Hey, that's it, there he is," and he goes running over, "Can I hold your baby?" And he holds him and just has this song of praise. He's looking at him, and he says, one of the first things he says is, "Lord, now you can dismiss your servant in peace." And this is, I think, further exemplifying the aims of the centuries under the law that God had, the goal that he had of pointing towards the coming Messiah, the consolation of Israel. And now it's even further exemplified by the fact that Simeon recognizes that he is transcended and dismissed by the fulfillment of the law in the Christ. And so it's really just this amazing thing. We can see that, like I said, almost as if the personification of the Old Testament is here saying, this is what we have been trying to point humanity towards since the beginning. And here he is. And now we gracefully bow out and rejoice in what it is that he is seeking to accomplish as he seeks to, as he fulfills the law. Again, not getting rid of it, not erasing it, not destroying it, but fulfilling it as he did. And that, so I think those two ideas kind of correlate with the idea of him being there and his parents going through all of these Jewish rituals, but again, not for his sake, but for the sake of his flock. And we see that Simeon, in his prior faith, is rewarded with present sight. I've got a quote here from Matthew Henry that I really like. After Simeon says, "Oh Lord, now you can dismiss your servant in peace," he's ready to die now. And this quote from Matthew Henry says, "How poor does the world look to one who has Christ in his arms and salvation in his view." That's my prayer for us, that we may hold Christ in our arms and keep salvation in our view, and then we may see how poor the world and the flesh and all of the sinful temptations that such things can offer, that we may look at them and instead keep our eyes on Christ in our arms and salvation in our view, and regard those other things as just meager, paltry filth. So anyways, thank you for joining me. Hope you guys are staying safe and enjoying extra family time from 6 feet away. All right. Love you. Bye.